Welcome back everyone. I bought this one from my local distillery fairly recently as I was passing by, and it's the latest in a line of single grain whiskies made by the English distillery, or St George's Distillery as it used to be known, and like all of their other single grain whiskies it's marketed as the Norfolk. So the reason why this one isn't a single malt is purely because of the mash bill, and the mash bill on this one is predominantly maize or sweet corn, rye and barley. Interestingly, the barley that goes into this, they don't specify whether it's malted or unmalted, but I would imagine that it's probably likely to be malted barley because as a single malt distillery, it's something that they have on hand. I did actually ask what the breakdown of the mash bill is on this one, and they won't say. So they've kind of got this slightly old-fashioned attitude that a lot of distilleries used to have, that they think they have trade secrets that need protecting, and if word gets out then the competitors will just be making carbon copies of their products, which is a little bit frustrating and annoying in a time where most independent distilleries these days are giving us as much information as we can ask for, because they know that the devil is in the details, and that's what enthusiasts are buying. We are not buying inebriation, we're buying a handcrafted product, we're buying the process. So a little bit odd and a little bit annoying, especially when you consider that they've already told us the components that go into the mash bill. We've been told that the three core components of this are barley, rye and maize, so it's a little bit annoying that they won't tell us any more information there. Although I'd guess that if you used a mash bill, probably 70% maize, 20% barley, 10% rye, you'd probably be in the right ballpark with this one. Also, minor disappointment on my behalf with this one, that they've used 3 ingredients for this one which are very commonly used in the bourbon market, because I know that the English Whisky Company, they've done a lot of experiments with some more unusual grains. They're really at the forefront of grain experimentation. But obviously there's a reason why a lot of bourbons use these fairly similar mash bills consisting of maize, rye, barley and wheat. Sort of pick 2 or 3 of those and vary the proportions very slightly, and that describes most of the bourbons in the world. And that reason is because they're tried and tested mash bills and they work. Where this single grain is different from a lot of other grain whiskies though, is that this one is distilled in the same pair of copper pot stills that English Whisky Company use for their single malt. So hopefully this should have quite a bit more character and complexity compared to a lot of other column distilled spirits. As for the details on the label of this one, because it doesn't come in a box or a tube or anything, this is literally all we've got. I'll give you a little close up as well, because as always with English Whisky Company, it's a really nice presentation. The seal in the Norfolk bowler hat as usual. Not a lot on the back label, but the details we've got is 45% ABV, it's non-chill filtered, and it actually states that on the lower half of the label there. It is natural colour, they say so. They said so on their email when they released this, and it says so on the website, but it doesn't say so on the label, which annoys the hell out of me. But moving on, it's matured in virgin oak barrels. There's only 1,500 bottles of this, 1,500, and they're also, as with all of the English Whisky Company grain whiskies, because they're experimental, they are in the smaller 500ml bottle. So let's get some in the glass and see what it's like. So we know that it's natural colour, even though they haven't given us the guarantee on the label. But that, we know that it's a natural colour whisky, and it's probably about what you would expect from a distilled spirit aged in virgin oak. Quite dark. It's obviously picked up quite a lot of colour from that charred, unused oak. On the nose, again, it's kind of what you would expect, getting notes of sawn oak and oak spice. some ginger and nutmeg on the nose, so lots of aromas coming through on the nose from that virgin oak cask. Also a really nice, slightly musty lime note on the nose, as well as a really pleasant sweet maltiness that suggests that the barley in this probably is malted, as you'd expect, and really shows off those pot stills. Probably should have mentioned the reason why they call this popcorn whiskey, or at least I think they called it that on the website. It just says the Norfolk popcorn, and on the back it says the Norfolk single grain whiskey, and the reason for that is because this is obviously a bourbon inspired grain whiskey from the English Whisky Company in Norfolk, and like all bourbon made in the States has to by law be at least 51% sweet corn or maize in the mash bill, and it's the same thing with this. They've called it popcorn because it's using that same base ingredient as popcorn, and they've also called it popcorn because in the tasting notes from the English Whisky Company they say that it has strong flavours of popcorn, and a lot of people have also described it as being very like a bourbon. So let's see. On the palate, lots of sweet caramel, so that's a very stereotypical bourbon note. It is, I think if I tasted this blind I would probably guess that it is a good bourbon. It reminds me of one of the slightly more cerebral sort of thinking man's bourbon, things like, and some of you might disagree with me, but reminds me of things like Eagle Rare, some of the bourbons that are perhaps a little bit more gentle and a little bit more complex. But that sweetened caramel on the palate, it really doesn't last very long. It's there in spades on the arrival, and it's immediately replaced with some slightly sharp, citrus, juicy, malty notes, in particular a really nice sweet orange zest note. And just as advertised, there is a bit of a popcorn note. There's a distinct sweet corn, maize, nutty, popcorn and peanut brittle note on the palate of this whiskey. Let's have another sip. Quite floral on the palate, floral and estery, fruity, a note of sweetened orange juice and cut flowers. Also, and again coming through from that virgin oak cask, there's a really nice sour oakiness which gives it really great body, a really grippy and intense experience. As for the finish, I'm going to go with long, sweet and creamy. In my original notes that I made when I first tasted this, I actually wrote wheated ? I don't think I actually knew what the mash bill of this one was, or anything about the components that went into the mash bill when I first tasted this. And when I first tried it, that sort of gentle and complex character to this one made me think of things like William LaRue Weller and other wheated bourbons. Obviously there may be some wheat in this, but after finding out that the mash bill for this is maize, barley and rye, it's almost certainly that barley component giving that sort of slightly more gentle, complex character. Oakiness really does work very, very well on this one. That virgin oak doesn't overstep its mark at all. When I first saw this one and saw that it said cask type virgin oak on the label, I thought, do I really want to buy this? Because I'm not a huge fan of virgin oak. It can quite often be a complete spice bomb, and that really puts me off. But with this one, I was really proven wrong. It works really, really well. I think that it actually works better than the English Whisky Company's other grain whiskies, like the rye whiskies that they've done, some of which really did tend to be a little bit too much of a spice bomb for me. I think the combination of a high rye mash bill and virgin oak was just a little bit past the mark for me. And you do have to wonder if those people out in Rydham at the English Whisky Company, we're seeing a little bit of experimentation and sort of trial and error here. Perhaps they've kind of learnt from some of their mistakes, or not necessarily mistakes, but they're honing their craft batch by batch. Because I think this is one of the most interesting and innovative world whiskies that I've tried in a while. I think it's a really great pseudo-bourbon for Scotch drinkers, for bourbon drinkers, and English whisky drinkers. Of course, East Anglian grain whiskies aren't a new thing. and they're not even a thing that's exclusive to the English Whisky Company in Norfolk. Adnams Copperhouse Distillery in Southwold in Suffolk, they've been making grain whiskies for quite a while, including this one. And personally, I think that this popcorn whisky is much, much better. I think that this whisky is much more mature and more balanced than the grain whiskies from Adnams, whereas the Adnams single grain, I believe they used virgin French oak for all of their whiskies, which made it very, very lopsided and kind of unbalanced in my opinion. Whereas this one, it's not only beautifully balanced in the components of the mash bill, but I think it's beautifully balanced in the spirit compared to the cask as well. Compared to my previous favourite grain whisky from the English Whisky Company, which would be the Farmer's single grain, which was also a multi-grain mash bill grain whisky, I think that this one's at least as good and clearly shows that this is a more maize-driven spirit. It is very bourbon-esque, although in my opinion it's bourbon with a little bit extra. I imagine that this is probably what it would be like if Jim Beam had a go at making a single malt, because I think that this has a lot of similarities with the higher strength Jim Beams, but I think this one's quite a bit fruitier, and that's undoubtedly a combination of the malted barley that goes into this, the long fermentation times, and those small copper pot stills. A very, very good hybrid spirit that's well worth a try. So thanks for watching. Let me know what you think if you've tried this one, although I'd imagine that probably a lot of people haven't, and hopefully this stuff is still available. There is only 1,500 bottles, which is really not a lot. When the English Whisky Company say that they're making a small batch release, they really mean it. They make it really small, sometimes even single cask. But one nice thing about the English Whisky Company is that their releases tend not to sell out very quickly. Particularly their single grain whiskies can be really, really interesting though. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.